The dinner was still warm on the stove, but the entire family had vanished without a single goodbye. 409 Ellison Street, South Atlanta, evening of March 11th, 2020. Inside, chicken still cooking in the skillet, rice bubbling in the pot, 2 dining chairs pulled out, and a purple school backpack resting by the door. The back door was left open, the hallway light still on. The Brown family's dog, usually loud and energetic, was lying silently in the bathroom. It hadn't been fed in days. No noise, no blood, no signs of a struggle, just a feeling like something had been suddenly interrupted. And then they were never seen again. 4 years have passed. No ransom calls, no mysterious dreams, not a single credit card swipe. The Brown family, Marvin, Rachael, Mathew, and little Ava, erased from the map as if they had never existed. Until one day in April, when a crew of workers, digging behind the neighborhood to fix a water line, hit something cold, metallic, buried deep beneath the ground. Marvin Brown wasn't the kind of man you'd turn around for on the street, but anyone who ever stopped by the garage at Pump 6 in South Atlanta would remember him for something else, a quiet kind of kindness. He didn't talk much, wasn't good with words, but if your car stalled in the middle of the road, or you blew a tire in the rain, he'd show up, hands covered in grease, offering a soft smile. At 38, Marvin had been the lead mechanic at that shop for nearly a decade. He'd grown up in the Little Creek neighborhood, trained at a community center just a few blocks from his childhood home. Friends described him as the type of guy who would rather spend 2 extra hours fixing your brakes, right, than send you home with a risk. He never got rich doing what he did, but he took pride in his work, and even more so in what he built outside that garage, his family. To Marvin, family was the safest, truest place on earth. He always clocked out before 6 p.m., just in time to pick the kids up from coding class or ballet. Most evenings, you'd find him stretched out on the living room floor, listening to Mathew explain his new software project or pretending to sleep while little Ava played doctor on her patient. On weekends, he'd take the family to the farmer's market to shop for seedlings. His quiet dream was to grow a garden in their backyard where the kids could learn to plant and play safely. But peace wasn't always guaranteed. Just 3 weeks before the disappearance, Marvin confided in a close friend that he'd been getting strange messages, no name, just vague warnings. He never told Rachael, never went to the police. Maybe he thought he could handle it, or maybe he just didn't want her to worry. No one realized that his silence would become the first ripple in a wave of irreversible loss. If Marvin was the steady hand holding the house, from the outside, Rachael Brown was its warm, beating heart within. 36 years old, barely 5'3", but her voice carried weight, not because it was loud, but because it held calm certainty wrapped in gentleness. Anyone who ever visited the Maple Haven community clinic knew Miss Rachael, the friendly medical assistant who remembered every patient's name, every kid's story, and who always took extra time with the elderly after their checkups. She didn't just do the job, she did it with purpose. Born and raised in Atlanta, Rachael had watched generation after generation in Little Creek struggle with poor health care, misinformation, and fear of hospitals. She once dreamed of becoming a doctor, but a long, academic road and early motherhood led her down another path. Even as an assistant, though, she inspired from young patients to bright-eyed med interns. At home, Rachael was the planner, the birthday card maker, the sticky note queen who posted gentle reminders all over the fridge. Mathew, don't forget to debug your code. Or Ava, else addressed today. She kept a small notebook where she jotted down thoughts, short poems, daily feelings, even things that made her uneasy, though she couldn't explain why. One line would later send chills down spines. Someone's been following me the past few days. Or maybe I'm just imagining it. Friends said Rachael was no pushover, sharp-minded, hard to fool, but she was also deeply trusting, especially of those she let into her inner circle. One nurse recalled how Rachael once lost money to an old friend who conned her. Instead of getting angry, she simply said, "I really tried to help them." To Marvin, she was the one who kept everything grounded. To Mathew and Ava, she was their whole world. On weekend nights, she'd turn on soft jazz and dance with the kids in the living room, the warm, yellow lights flickering like a movie scene. A family that wasn't flashy, not loud, but full of love. And maybe that's why their disappearance shattered the neighborhood, as if someone had quietly stolen its heart. Mathew Brown was the kind of kid who could catch adults off guard, not because he was wild, but because his curiosity ran deep. At just 10 years old, he could sit for hours in front of an old laptop teaching himself Python through YouTube videos. He built a simple game with code and proudly told his dad, "Try level 3. I made it run faster." Marvin didn't know much about tech, but he always made time. To Mathew, what mattered most wasn't the game. It was being seen by the people he loved. Mathew wasn't loud, wasn't the type to lead playground crews, but classmates said he knew how to listen. Always lent you a pen without making it a thing. Teachers called him a promising computer science mind, though a little introverted. In many ways, he mirrored his dad, quiet, steady, but unmistakably full of love for his family. Ava, his 7-year-old sister, was the sunshine in Boas Getchewabstatzal. Contrast. Petite, with braided pigtails and a glittery pink backpack covered in cats. Ava loved to dance, not to choreography, but to the music inside her head. Each morning, when Rachael played tunes in the kitchen, Ava would twirl 3 times in the living room, like it was her Broadway stage. She also had a gift for making people laugh, like the time she stood in the middle of a supermarket, pointed at the fluorescent lights, and said, "These lights make me sleepy." Mathew and Ava were 2 very different worlds, but stuck together like glue. Mathew would quietly check her shoes before leaving the house, and Ava would narrate every tiny moment of her day to him before bed. "Our teacher wore a cat shirt today, but like a fierce cat, okay?" These children, gone, left a hole, not just in their families' hearts, but in the soul of an entire neighborhood. Little Creek was the kind of place where neighbors still waved from their porches. Mr. Henry on the corner handed out pickled cucumbers on birthdays. Miss Laverne sold waffles every Sunday morning. Everyone knew Marvin helped fix cars for free. Rachael once held a CPR class at the local church. And then, one March morning in 2020, they were just gone. At first came surprise, then doubt, then fear, and finally, a sorrow too hard to name. Because people who seemed like they'd always be there suddenly weren't, and no one knew why. March 11th, 2020. Just another ordinary afternoon in Little Creek. No weather alerts. No major news. Around 5:30 p.m., the security camera at Kim's Market, on the corner of Ellison and Maple, captured the last known images of the Brown family. Rachael was at the register paying. Ava stood beside her, sucking on a lollipop. Mathew was trailing behind, eyes fixed on his phone. Marvin waited outside, leaning casually against the glass, chatting with a man in a gray jacket, his face obscured from view. No one present at the store that day remembered anything unusual. The Browns appeared as they always did, not rushed, not tense. They carried 2 bags of groceries, a few toiletries, and walked out of the store at 5:44 p.m. That was the last time they were seen in public. The next morning, the lead physician at Maple Haven Clinic noticed something odd. Rachael didn't show up for work. That was almost unheard of. She was always on time, down to the minute, often the first one in, brewing coffee for the team. She hadn't called in. Her phone didn't go through. A coworker assumed she might be sick. But by that afternoon, when Marvin also failed to show at the garage, something he had never done, without notice, his best friend, Deshaun felt a gut sense that something was wrong. That evening, the Browns' back neighbor, Mrs. Tesses, Whitaker, noted the kitchen lights still glowing. Late into the night. No one coming or going. No TV sounds. Just a warm light behind the glass. And the family. Dog barking endlessly from the downstairs bathroom. Strange, since Marvin always let it sleep in its crate out on the porch at night. By day 2, the school called Rachael to report. Mathew and Ava's absence, unexcused. No word from home. Still no answer. Still no returned messages. Friends, coworkers, neighbors began texting each other. Has anyone heard from the Browns? No one had. Just theories. Maybe they went out of town? A family emergency? By day 3, Rachel's cousin Janelle decided to stop by the Suitcase house herself. The front door was locked. She knocked. No response. She walked around back and found the rear door slightly ajar. A stale food smell lingered in the air. The kitchen was strangely chaotic. A full pot of soup on the stove, cold rice in the cooker. Rachel's phone still plugged in on the table. Her usual brown wallet lay under the couch. No voices. No footsteps. Just a thirsty dog. And signs of a life abruptly interrupted. Janelle called the police. When Fulton County officers arrived at 409 Ellison Street later that March 13th evening, they didn't seem overly alarmed. A missing family wasn't exactly rare, and often people simply disappeared to take a break from their lives. They usually reappeared after a few days, with simple explanations: an unplanned trip, a private issue, a lost signal. The initial report followed standard protocol, possibly left voluntarily. But for those who knew the Browns, that idea was immediately rejected. They're not the type to just vanish, Janelle stated in her first interview. Rachael would never miss a shift without notice. And Marvin, he never left without his tools. What puzzled the investigators wasn't what they found, but what they didn't. No sign of forced entry. No broken glass. No pried doors. No odd sounds reported by neighbors. The house was eerily still. Too still. Like someone had deliberately tried not to disturb a thing. One officer on the scene remarked, "It's like someone hit pause." The Little Creek community quickly mobilized. Neighbors shared updates on local forums. Some organized informal search teams combing nearby woods and back alleys. A local church hosted a prayer vigil and shared info. Flyers with photos of the smiling family taken at Piedmont Park the previous summer were taped to lampposts, shop windows, bus stops. Bold red letters asked, "Have you seen them?" But the community's efforts weren't matched by the authorities. The case wasn't treated as a high priority. In a press conference on March 15th, a police spokesperson said, "At this time, there is no clear evidence of criminal activity." To many, that was just a more polite way of saying, "They're black, and no one's paying enough attention." Janelle kept pressing the department. She mentioned that Mathew had once talked about a man who lingered near his school, didn't speak, just watched. Rachael had written about someone following her after work. But without concrete evidence, those claims were dismissed. Police didn't issue search warrants for the family's phones. They didn't pull security footage from neighboring blocks within the crucial first 72 hours. Meanwhile, Little Creek began to shift. Doors locked earlier. Parents warned their kids not to walk home alone. The Brown family, once a symbol of stability and communal trust, became a whispered name in the dark, laced with unease and a single haunting question: what really happened? On March 14th, 3 days after the Browns vanished, both Marvin and Rachel's phones stopped transmitting entirely. Calls went straight to voicemail. Messages got no response. A volunteer search group included a telecom technician who managed to trace the last ping from both devices around 7 o'clock p.m. on March 11th near Suitcase, their home. After that, silence. No movement. No connection to other cell towers. As if the phones and their owners had been swallowed whole. Soon after, strange signs started surfacing around the neighborhood. A doorbell cam at 417 Ellison, just 2 houses down, recorded a blurry image of a brown pickup truck at 3:12 a.m. on March 12th. The engine was off, headlights dark. It sat motionless for nearly 6 minutes before slowly backing away and driving off. No one ever saw who was inside. The homeowners hadn't even noticed until a search team requested a full data review. Though police accepted the footage, they dismissed it as inconclusive. No plate, no faces. Another detail emerged from within the house. On a second walkthrough of the kitchen, investigators noticed a single dining chair, misaligned, pushed noticeably toward the back door. Beneath it, lay a small scrap of gray fabric. Preliminary checks showed it didn't match any known clothing from the Browns. But with no blood, no clear DNA, it was never prioritized for deeper testing. Janelle continued pushing. She gave police a list of places Marvin had worked, part-time. One name stood out, a small logistics company where Marvin once repaired delivery trucks. Rumor had it the company was a front for something illegal. Marvin left after a few months and never spoke of it again. On March 20th, police officially opened a missing persons investigation for all 4 members of the Brown family. But for many, that step came far too late. By then, crucial evidence may have faded, lost to time and inaction. And the question was no longer just, where are they, but who wanted them gone? In the days that followed, the rumors multiplied. Some said the family ran away. Others whispered about Marvin's old debts. But those who truly knew the Browns, who saw Rachael's quiet compassion, who heard Marvin call Mathew his little engineer, felt only one thing: something deeply wrong was being hidden behind the silence of a darkened house. As news of the Brown family's disappearance began circulating on local media, people who'd once crossed paths with them started coming forward, each bringing small, seemingly insignificant details that suddenly felt important. A coworker from the garage where Marvin worked recalled that in the week leading up to his disappearance, Marvin had seemed more tense than usual. He kept checking his phone and once even stepped out mid-shift to take a call, returning with a heavy expression. When asked about it, he only said, family stuff. At the time, no one thought much of it, not until he never came back. An old friend of Marvin's named Terrell, who lived on Atlanta's west side, said Marvin used to work for a private transport crew about 2 years earlier. Marvin had left after a dispute with the manager and never went back. But just weeks before he disappeared, Marvin texted Terrell asking about an old delivery truck that used to belong to that company. Terrell hadn't understood why Marvin was suddenly interested again, but now it felt ominous. On Rachael's side, a fellow staff member at the clinic remembered her once talking about a strange feeling, like she was being followed after late shifts. One night, she paused in the parking lot, thinking someone was behind her, but when she turned around, no one was there. She didn't report it, just brushed it off with a quiet, maybe I'm just tired. But in hindsight, that throwaway memory took on a chilling weight. Despite these accounts, police maintained a cautious stance. Without clear signs of criminal activity, they couldn't issue warrants or compel interviews. One detective admitted, "We're being held back by the system and the complete lack of physical evidence." Privately, he suspected something darker was unfolding, but had no proof. Then came a tip from an Uber driver who lived in Little Creek. After seeing the news, he called the hotline and shared that on the night of March 11th, just hours after the Browns were last seen, he'd been driving home when he heard an odd sound coming from the alley behind their house. It was like something being dragged across the ground. Not loud, just slow, like someone was trying not to make noise. When asked why he hadn't reported it earlier, he simply said, "I didn't know it meant anything, not until now." Pieces began to emerge, but instead of forming a clear picture, they led in tangled directions. No one was outright lying, but no one was telling the whole truth either. And the silence, especially from those who seemed uninvolved, started to feel deeply unsettling. One of the most baffling details for investigators was the neighborhood's camera system. The Browns didn't have a security cam of their own, but several homes on Ellison Street used doorbell cameras with motion capture. Yet, on the very night the Browns vanished, many of those systems mysteriously malfunctioned. Cameras at 4:07, 4:11, and 4:15 all went offline between 1:13 a.m. and just before 4 o'clock a.m. Footage during that window was corrupted, unrecoverable. Technical experts didn't rule out the possibility of temporary interference from a short-range signal jammer, a device uncommon but easily available online for those who know where to look. It only strengthened suspicions that this wasn't a family leaving by choice, but a calculated operation designed to leave no trail. The question was, Who had the resources? And the reason? One name began surfacing more and more in whispered conversations around the neighborhood. Clyde Henderson. He lived directly across from the Browns at 410. Ellison. A man so quiet it bordered on strange. He lived alone. No visitors. Rarely spoke to neighbors. A former electronics technician who'd retired early due to heart issues. In all the time since the Browns disappeared, Clyde never once asked about them, never showed up. At a community meeting, never engaged in the searches. Janelle, Rachel's cousin, once knocked on his door while handing out flyers. No one answered. She slipped one through the doorframe. Days later, that same flyer, torn in half, was left on her doorstep. Then, a month after the disappearance, Clyde abruptly moved out, in the middle of the night. No notice to anyone. No contact with the neighborhood management. His house sat empty for nearly a year before a young couple bought it. And it was while cleaning out the attic that they made a discovery that took the investigation in a chilling new direction, a small hand-drawn map. It had the Brown home circled, along with 3 other locations scattered across South Atlanta, an abandoned garage, an unfinished construction lot, and a disused storage unit near the train tracks. Police responded immediately. At the 3rd location, the garage, investigators found, buried beneath piles of rusted metal, debris, a few broken electronic devices, scraps of torn clothing, and half a family photo. The Browns smiling together. But only Rachael and Mathew were still in frame. Marvin and Ava had been ripped away. No one knows why. But as one officer at the scene said, the air in Sassos. There was so cold, you didn't need AC to feel it. In your bones. There were still no bodies. No confessions. But now, no one believed the Browns simply walked away. They didn't vanish by choice. Someone made it happen. And perhaps that someone is still out there, watching, as quietly as they struck that night. April 6, 2024, 4 years to the day since the Brown family disappeared. A city maintenance crew was dispatched to the Ellison neighborhood to inspect an aging drainage system. While digging behind an overgrown vacant lot about Chawahut, 4 blocks from the Brown residence, the team noticed something odd, uneven soil layers, as if the earth had once been dug up and refilled, but not with machinery. One worker, a former military serviceman, felt uneasy. This isn't natural settling. Something's under there. Roughly a meter down, they struck metal. As they brushed away the soil, the crew fell, silent. It was 2 large suitcases, the kind used for international travel, but now rusted, rough to the touch, with handles barely hanging on. Police were called immediately and sealed off the site. Everyone held their breath as the suitcases were opened, but there were no bodies, no blood, just items. But not just any items. A navy blue jacket with a faded tech club sticker, just like the one Mathew wore to his programming class. A smiley face keychain Marvin always carried. The birthday gift from Ava. And a handmade red thread bracelet strung with colorful plastic beads, the word mom scribbled, crookedly, unmistakably made by Ava. Then there was one more thing. A small piece of paper, water-stained and smudged, but still readable. Scrawled in black marker were 5 chilling words. I told you, stay quiet. Too vague to confirm anything, but enough to suggest one thing clearly. Someone had given a warning, and someone didn't listen. Or maybe they did, and still couldn't escape the consequences. Police began forensic testing on the suitcases immediately. But after 4 years underground, there was little left to extract. No usable fingerprints, no hairs, no blood, just the objects, silent, haunting remnants of a family that once laughed, lived, and held each other and was taken from the world. And without bodies, the case still couldn't legally be declared a homicide. They remain by law missing persons, but no one, not anymore, believed they were coming back. The moment the suitcases were confirmed to be linked to the Brown family, investigators pulled up Marvin's contact history from his final week. One name stood out, Cameron C.J. Reeves. C.J. wasn't a stranger. He had once been Marvin's side business partner in Kyons, a short-lived truck electrical repair venture. The project fizzled out by late 2018, and they stopped working together, though they kept in sporadic contact via occasional texts. CJ was known to show up at Marvin's garage now, and then casually referring to himself as Marvin's brother from another mother, but no one could really say how close they actually were. After the suitcase discovery, a detail that had been overlooked suddenly became relevant. The week Marvin went missing, CJ had been caught on camera at a gas station, about a mile from the Browns' home, at 3:00 a.m. He didn't pump gas, didn't use a credit card. He simply stood next to a brown pickup truck for 8 minutes and left. The footage had never been reviewed because the station's system only retained recordings for 35 hours, days, and no one had thought to request it until now. A young detective took it upon himself to track CJ down. He was living in the suburbs of Macon, 2 hours from Atlanta, working maintenance at a freight company. When asked about Marvin, CJ appeared surprised, but not shaken. "I didn't know anything about that disappearance," he said. "Last time I saw Marvin was earlier that year. Just talked for a bit, that's it." When pressed about the brown pickup, CJ replied, "I used to have one like that, but I sold it. Police ran the old registration." CJ had indeed owned a 2002 bronze Ford pickup, sold in March 2020, the same month the Browns vanished. The buyer never filed a title transfer, and the truck hasn't been found since. When asked to voluntarily submit DNA and fingerprints for elimination purposes, CJ refused, citing privacy rights. It wasn't illegal, but it raised eyebrows. Still, with no physical evidence tying him to the scene, police couldn't arrest him. Reaction among Marvin and Rachael's relatives was mixed. Janelle, Rachael's cousin, said she had never heard Rachael mention CJ, but Marvin's longtime friend remembered him well. "CJ, Marvin helped him out a lot, but CJ, he took advantage. Money stuff. I remember Marvin once said something weird. I trust him, but I'd never let him in my house when I'm not there." Now, CJ Reeves sits in a strange place, a shadow figure hovering between suspicion and impunity, untouchable, uncharged, but impossible to ignore. And that's what makes the truth so disturbing. It wasn't a stranger in the night. It might have been someone trusted, someone once welcomed, who may have been the reason an entire family disappeared. June 2024, 2 months after the suitcases were unearthed and the name CJ Reeves began circulating as a potential suspect, momentum around the Brown family's disappearance suddenly stalled. The public, once fired up with a sense that the truth was finally within reach, now fell into quiet skepticism. Because despite rising suspicion, CJ hadn't been arrested. He hadn't been charged. No hard evidence tied him to the scene. And worse, the police themselves were starting to fracture. According to a source inside the department, at least 2 senior investigators disagreed sharply on the direction of the case. One side saw CJ as a red herring, someone easy to suspect because of a murky past, but possibly not the culprit. The other side insisted he knows more than he's saying. Then, just as silence began to set in, a discovery shook everything once more. A volunteer group formed by Janelle and a few friends from Little Creek had been combing through abandoned buildings around Atlanta hoping for anything new. Inside a rundown warehouse, once owned by a now defunct shipping company, they uncovered an old wooden box buried beneath torn crates and moldy tarps. Inside were scraps of paper, a broken-down phone, a fuel card, and a small dust-covered pair of children's shoes. They were purple sneakers, small, trimmed with silver. Ava Brown had worn that very pair during her last family outing to the park. A photo confirmed it. But the truly haunting part was inside the shoe. There, written in shaky black ink, was a single line. "I'm scared." No one could say when it had been written. No fingerprints, no DNA, just that sentence, tiny, slanted, trembling. To Janelle, it was unmistakable. That's a child's handwriting. Ava was left-handed. That line leans left. I know it was her. Police collected the box and sent it for analysis. The results were frustratingly inconclusive. No prints, no timeline, no direct forensic links. Once again, the evidence stirred emotion, but couldn't trigger action. And now, the question grew more painful than ever. If Ava was still aware enough to write that plea, what happened after? Who held them? And why was it? A child, not a camera, not a witness, who left. The only cry for help when the contents of Ava's shoe were quietly shared. Not with the press, but at a community meeting organized by neighbors. The reaction was unlike anything before. No outbursts, no demands, just a deep, aching silence. As if everyone there understood some things are too cruel to name and too faint to prove. Old theories began to crumble. The Browns didn't leave voluntarily, as once suggested. That notion now felt insulting. They didn't walk away from jobs, from friends, from their kids, only to have their belongings buried in dirt and a child's shoes found in a rotting warehouse. C.J. Reeves, once the prime focus, now loomed in, eerie quiet. He hadn't left his house in weeks. His lawyer issued a statement. My client is not involved in his reputation's being harmed unlawfully. Some began to believe CJ wasn't the mastermind, just a small piece in something much larger, more complex. But if that's true, who was pulling the strings? And why the Browns? A family with no known ties to crime, no reason to be targeted. Police had no answers. They admitted leads had gone cold, and physical evidence was too weak to prosecute. An internal memo put it plainly. This case may never be fully resolved without a new witness or confession. But who would speak? Who? After 4 years of silence, had reason to finally break it? One evening in early July, Janelle stood in the front yard of the abandoned house at 409 Ellison. With her volunteer group behind her, she placed a new pair of little girl's shoes, purple, just like Ava's, on the porch step. The house was still vacant, curtains still drawn. No light had shone through since that March night. She said only one sentence. If anyone has ever seen something, heard something, this is the time to speak. No one came that night, and in the morning, the shoes were still there, now dusted with a thin layer of dew. 4 years later, 409. Ellison Street still stands, like a gay, unfinished portrait. The wooden door is faded. Dust coats the handle. Moss stains the steps. Folks in Little Creek don't stop to look inside anymore. Not because they forgot, but because they can't bear the weight of feeling so helpless. The Brown family used to be part of this place. Marvin once changed neighbor's oil for free. Rachael once carried an elderly patient down the clinic stairs. Mathew once fixed up an old laptop just to gift it to a classmate. Ava once danced through the open-air market and made everyone smile. They weren't a name on a missing persons report. They were real, present, laughing, loving. And then they vanished in one night without saying goodbye. No bodies, no suspect, no justice. Just a few scattered belongings buried in dirt. A single paper scrap with a silent threat. One tiny shoe marked with trembling words. And hundreds of questions no one will answer. Some disappearances never make the front page. Some victims are never prioritized. Some families, especially those who are Black, who live in working-class neighborhoods, never get what the system calls closure. They're left behind in stories cut short, then slowly buried by time. But silence is a choice, and every time we choose it, the darkness wins, little more. So if you're watching this, just stop for 1 minute. Look at the faces of the people you love. Now imagine what it would feel like if one day they vanished, no trail, no noise, and you were left with nothing but the unbearable truth. You may never know what really happened. What do you think happened to the Brown family? Were they taken, forced to leave? Who is behind that shadow? If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, if you believe Ava deserves to be found, that Rachael deserves to come home, that Marvin deserves answers, and Mathew, the little coder, might still be out there, waiting for someone to pick up the pieces of a truth left half written, then don't look away.